Hello everyone, here's a brief tutorial on how to write a philosophy paper, and I'll look at some of the specific issues that might come up with the prompt that you have for the paper on the apology. So just for some important dates for this first paper, next week we're going to have peer review on Monday, September 27th. Please remember to bring a physical copy of your paper with you and, if possible, a pen that isn't black. If you have any trouble getting a copy of your paper printed out, please let me know and I will print it for you. You just have to let me know in time because I can't print it on campus. I currently don't have access to the printer in the department until I get my code. If you want me to look at a draft of the paper, you can make an appointment with me. Several people have emailed me already. Please email me to set up an appointment. My office hours are booking up, although I can book other times as well. And then the paper will be due Sunday, October 3rd at noon. Feel free to turn it in early if you're done with it early and you want to have some time to yourself on Sunday. The paper should be about 750 to 1,000 words. This is approximately 3 pages double-spaced. It's a very short paper, and the reason I'm having you do a short paper exercise is I want you to practice trying to be as concise as possible while still being precise. This is a really important skill for philosophy, but is also a skill that's going to be important to you in pretty much any area that you go into. Because there are often cases where you have to present a short, coherent argument, especially to committees or in meetings, and you'll often put a memo with that will allow people to have the information they need to be able to evaluate your argument. And so this is really good practice because people don't want to read too much. So if you're having trouble filling the space, I think that you should look back and make sure that you have answered all of the questions in the prompt because there's a lot of information that you need to cover in the paper. If you follow the guidelines for the individual components, you shouldn't have any trouble filling the space, and in fact, you'll probably end up with way more words than you're allowed to have, in which case you need to set the paper aside for a day if possible, and then come back to it and try to cut it down. The tight word count challenges you to make the words count within the paper, and also to make your sentences count. So every sentence should be in there for a reason. And if I were to ask you what it's doing, you should be able to tell me what the position it has in the argument is. So do not use secondary sources. This means don't go onto any kind of website looking for information about Socrates' answers to these questions in the apology. Don't look in any books. Just stay away from secondary sources. I want you to show me that you can read the primary text yourself. If you do happen to use a secondary source for some reason, make sure that you cite them in a standard format so that I can go and find the source that you're using. And the reason that I tell you not to use them at all is because secondary sources probably aren't going to be a lot of help to you on this particular topic. One is because there's sort of different schools of interpreting Plato, some of which are more or less accurate to the text. And part of it is because this paper is a purely expository paper, and usually secondary sources, like some of them are going to give you help on reading it, but a lot of them are going to give you interpretational arguments that are more complicated than the issues that we're dealing with this class. Don't quote directly unless it's necessary, and what I mean by necessary is that you're dealing with the specific language that Socrates uses. If you do have an argument that relies upon the language that he's using, that's fine, and feel free to use direct quotes just to make it clear that you're analyzing the language of a particular quotation. Paraphrase rather than quote. So paraphrase is when you summarize a quote in your own words, and you want to cite all paraphrases and quotes. This is helpful to me because what happens is I can take a look at a particular passage and say, oh, okay, even though you're wrong, I can see how you got there, and I can be more generous with the points that I give you. If you don't cite paraphrases, it also might incline me to believe that you're not really reading the text carefully, but instead you're trying to remember what we talked about during class, or you've been reading a secondary source that is interpreting the text rather than actually scouring the text yourself for the answers to the particular questions that I have. And the point is, this is an exercise to see whether or not you can read these texts accurately and carefully. So it would defeat the purpose if you're not doing that as part of the assignment. Citations should be parenthetical citations with Stephanus numbers. Do not use the page numbers from the texts that I have given you. Use those marginal numbers. On some pages, they're going to be on the left side. On some pages, they're going to be on the right side because, of course, the PDFs are taken from physical books where it would be on the outside of the text in each case. So make sure that you use those correct citations. And these are also more helpful than the larger page numbers because they can pinpoint a little bit more accurately where in the text you're getting something from. It also means that you are welcome to read a different translation of the original Greek because it will still pinpoint the text in the right place if you use the marginal numbers that are in sync between most editions of Plato. You do not need to provide a works cited or a bibliography unless you have used sources other than what we've used in class. So if you use a different translation, do me a favor and cite it because I might be confused about some of the interpretations from the translation that we have. But if I know that you're using a different translation, I might be able to see where the language of that translation caused you to go wrong if something goes wrong. It's useful for me to be able to sort of like be as generous as possible with the points on this if I don't understand what you're trying to say. So the general structure of the paper is that you want to have an introduction that gives your expository thesis, so answers the question about why Socrates thinks that he makes the citizens of Athens happy, and then provides a roadmap. So this is going to tell me how you're going to answer the argument and give me a little bit of a hint about what your structure is going to look like. This is optional. You don't need the roadmap. There's other kinds of background information that you could give in the introduction instead. Just make sure that you don't overdo it with the background because that will take up your word count. And then you'll have the body of the paper, which should be in several paragraphs. And I'll talk about paragraphing in a minute. You do not need a conclusion. Your argument should be sufficiently coherent that you don't need to summarize it at the end. I should be able to follow the argument all the way through. If you feel that there is something lacking in your structure, you can try to add a conclusion to make it a little bit more coherent. That's okay. But I'm going to try to provide you with some tips so that you don't have to do that if you turn in a paper that has a conclusion like this. If you're trying to figure out what precise language looks like, you should take a look at this slide. So I say here, if you want to argue that living a life of virtue entails living a happy life, or that virtue is the only method of achieving a happy life, say that. Don't say virtue and happiness are intertwined or some other vague phrase. The idea here is that I want you to really specify what the relationship between these terms are. So make sure that you don't try to create something that sounds good but doesn't mean anything or doesn't mean enough. Rather, try to be as precise as possible and don't worry so much about the elegance of your language. I can help you with language elegance for future papers, or if you have a first draft, come in and we can sort of work on how to make philosophy papers sound good. But that's a sort of second step beyond being able to precisely interpret the texts. Along these lines, make sure your textual evidence actually backs up your claims. While I say that I'll be more generous if I can figure out what is going on in the text and why you might have made a mistake if you make some kind of an error, this means that you can't just cite something that's related if it doesn't say what your paraphrase says. So a couple people did this on the quiz where you wrote something and you gave me a citation, but I don't see any relationship between what you cited and what you're saying in your paraphrase. And in that case, I can't really be generous and give you the points because I still don't know what it is that went wrong. So try to make sure that you're being really accurate in the way that you are paraphrasing the text. And this doesn't mean that you want to borrow a lot of words from the text. In fact, that's more likely to be a problem because it might make it like vague or weird, but rather means that you need to really try to understand what the text means. And if you have questions about this, come to my office hours, come talk to me after class. Send me an email, let me know you're having trouble with a particular stretch of text, and we can talk about it together. And I'm happy to help you with these portions of the paper. You don't have to do this completely on your own. In general, this is about paragraphing. You should have fairly short paragraphs. So paragraphs should usually be between 75 and 200 words. There may be cases where paragraphs are going to be longer, and that's fine. I don't want you to freak out and divide paragraphs indiscriminately. The point is I want you to think about writing shorter paragraphs than you might write for other papers. Each paragraph should have a single purpose, which you can state in a single sentence. This is extraordinarily important. If you have too many ideas in a paragraph, it's difficult for your reader to follow, and it's often difficult for you to put them in a coherent order. If each paragraph has a specific purpose, it's really easy to figure out what's going on. In longer papers, which we might talk about later, you may want to have a paragraph that is a roadmap for what's coming next in the paper, in which case your paragraph isn't going to be easily stated in a single sentence. It's giving you a bunch of organizational information. However, in a paper that's this short, the only place you should be doing that is the introduction. So I wouldn't worry about that at the moment, and instead try to make sure that all of your paragraphs, except for your introductory paragraph, have a single purpose that you can state in a single sentence. And that sentence should usually, although not always, come close to the beginning of the paragraph, either as part of the transition sentence and your topic sentence, or as the second sentence, which is a topic sentence after your transition sentence. There are some cases where you might want to have your topic sentence at the end of a paragraph, but those are going to be rarer cases. Each paragraph needs to contribute to the overall argument made in your paper. If you have a paragraph with extraneous information that isn't necessary for the argument, that's a whole bunch of words that you just lost that you could use to reconstruct the argument, and it's probably going to detract from your grade. So one of the things that I want you to do is, after you've written your paper, put it aside for a couple days, come back to it, and make sure that every single paragraph is useful to you. Each paragraph should start with a transition that ties the information from the previous paragraph into the argument made by the current paragraph. You shouldn't have your transitions in general at the end of the previous paragraph. There are a whole bunch of reasons for this, and we don't need to go into exactly what they are, although I'm happy to talk to people about it if you're having trouble with this concept. But in general, you want the transitions at the beginning of the following paragraph, in part because that allows you to do some signposting, by which I mean that allows you to tell your reader where they are in the argument and how you're going to move from the previous argument that you gave to a new argument of this new paragraph, or components of the argument that are represented by each of the paragraphs. And when you do that at the beginning of a paragraph, it makes it easier for your audience to figure out what the purpose of each part of it is, and they don't have to go back and look at the end of the previous paragraphs. So one thing to note is you need to be careful about how much of the style you're absorbing from these Greek texts. So I had a history professor in undergraduate who used to say that she absolutely hated getting papers from her Greek students, as in from the students that were taking her ancient Greek language classes, because the Greeks have a really horrible habit of long, complex, run-on sentences. And this was very popular in prose, and in particular with this, there were a couple of Greek historians that we would read that had these absurdly long multi-clause sentences that are really difficult to understand, but sometimes when you're reading a lot of a particular author, you tend to imbibe some of their style without even meaning to do it. So what I want you to do is, if you have a habit of writing these long, complex sentences, Or if you have picked this up as a habit from reading a bunch of Plato this quarter, or this semester, take some time to put the paper aside and then come back and try to break your sentences into smaller components. So don't follow Plato's example. Good philosophical prose in English uses short, simple sentences. In particular, this is important when you're trying to give a claim and then a justification or an explanation for that claim. So a lot of you in homework assignments and on the quiz tend to have the first half of the sentence with a claim and the second half of a sentence where you give the explanation or the justification for that claim, and consequently you end up with either long run-on sentences or you end up giving short shrift to your explanation and not actually providing a sufficient explanation or justification for the claim. Instead, what I'd like you to do is try to split the ideas into multiple sentences. And this will force you to explain more clearly because it forces you to give a full explanation. This is something actually that I struggle with a lot in my own papers that I'm writing. And there's something that I'll do where I'll write out a paper sort of from my brain, and then I'll go back and be like, how many of these sentences can I divide in order to provide full explanations and make this as clear as possible? So this doesn't mean you're a bad writer if you come back and you realize that you're doing this. It's just that we often, as our brains are moving quickly while we're thinking through ideas and writing a first draft, you will often have a tendency to do this because that's how you would do it in speech as well. The grading of the paper is as follows. Your grade will be determined by two main factors, content and style/structure. So content is going to be more important than the style and the structure, although both of them are important for learning how to write properly. Roughly speaking, the content is what you say, so it's the specific claims that you're making about Socrates and the kind of argument that's coming out of Plato's Apology. And the style and structure is how you say that and how you organize it. Generally, what I do for grading is I read through the paper looking at the content and give the paper a base grade. And then I'll adjust that base grade based on style and structure of the paper. So your base grade is going to be determined by your content, what you say about the prompt, and then your grade can go up or down, up to 1 letter grade based on the style or structure of the paper. So this means that if you have really good content but your style and structure are really messed up, you can still get a pretty good grade on the paper. It will just demote you a little bit, and then part of what I'll have you do on the next paper is try to figure out how to solve some of those stylistic and structural issues. On the other hand, if you are a really great writer and you have fantastic style and structure, but you're really struggling with the content, it will help you that you have fantastic style and structure, but it will also be a red flag to make sure that you know how to read the content and that you can explain your ideas as carefully as possible, and I can try to help you with this as well. So factors that go into the style and structure component of the grade is your structure clear and easy to follow? So one way of sort of trying to improve your style or structure would be to provide a roadmap in the introduction in order to help make sure that I know where you're saying each thing in your paper, as in not the specific like page number or anything, but rather the order. And then the other thing is making sure your paragraphing is really good. So paragraphs in general, if possible, should be a topic sentence which includes both a transition and the topic. It also should signpost how the argument is moving forward. Everything must relate to that topic sentence, and each paragraph should make a single argument or a single point within your argument. And then the other question is about clarity. So is your writing clear? Is your word choice precise? So thinking back to the previous slide where I talked about saying that virtue and happiness are intertwined, right? That's an imprecise explanation of what's going on within the apology. So you want to make sure that your word choice is as precise as possible and that you don't needlessly use synonyms for words that we have. So if you are talking about virtue, you might be able to say, use the word excellence, because excellence is another perfectly reasonable translation of the Greek word arete. However, if you wanted to use, some other term that was a synonym to virtue in English, it might not be a synonym to the term in the original Greek, and it might not have the exact same connotations as the word virtue or excellence, right? So the idea here is that unless there's a good reason to use a synonym, and unless you're really clear that that synonym has the exact same connotations as the word that you're using, you should probably stick to using the same word that you used in the first place. If you are somebody who has taken a lot of English classes, this might cause you a certain amount of distress. So I remember the first time that I wrote a philosophy paper, my mom asked if she could read it because she was curious as to like what the difference between a philosophy paper and other types of paper were. And she was just totally incensed by the idea that you had to use the same word over and over again, because it made the prose sound kind of like boring and stilted and weird. But this is typical in philosophy because we have really precise definitions of words, and we try to make sure that our arguments rely on those precise definitions and don't have ambiguity. So think back to the first couple of classes where we talked about the importance of getting rid of ambiguity in philosophical arguments. And so this is the same kind of thing that you need to do in your paper. It may hurt your soul. If it does, you're welcome to talk to me about it, and we'll try to figure out ways where you can make your philosophical prose a little bit more interesting stylistically. But it is really important to make sure you're precise. The next thing is, are your sentences free of grammatical errors? Grammatical errors are generally like not so bad, and I'm not going to mark that much off for them. However, you want to make sure that you don't have any grammatical errors that will impinge upon the clarity of your text. So it is important to read for them. But what I'm saying is that I understand that there are cases where you've just read the paper too many times and you're going to miss that there's a small grammatical error in a sentence. Then the last thing, which is the most important thing, is, are your paragraphs and sentences concise and to the point? You don't have any extra words. I don't want you to have any extra content or extra summary. Be straightforward, be clear, give less rather than more background. Try to be concise and to the point. Factors that go into the base grade, which is the content, are the following. So, did you respond to all the elements of the prompt? You want to make sure that you do that. Are your responses complete, or are they missing information? So you want to make sure that you have all of the steps necessary to provide the full argument, and you don't want to have any missing steps where I have to make some kind of a logical leap to get from one claim to the next. And then the last thing is, how clear are your logical relationships between the claims that you consider? So are you making it apparent why Socrates is connecting two ideas? And then the last thing is the number of mistakes that you make. So how many errors do you make within the paper? Are those errors major errors or minor errors? So giving an example, if you respond to all elements about the prompt, but your presentation of one of the divisions is missing, or one of the questions is missing information, then you might have a sort of like base grade of a B, including if you make some minor mistakes reconstructing the argument in the paper along with that. So The idea is that the fewer mistakes that you make, the better that grade is going to be, but also the less missing information you have, the better that grade is going to be. So there are sort of a lot of different ways that the base grade could change based on the content. And then that grade, so let's say you have that base grade of a B. If your style and structure is really good, you might have it move up to an A minus. And if your structure and style is really problematic, you might have it move down. If it's really bad, you might have it move down as much as a C. So just think about the different aspects of the paper. Try more for the content than for style and structure, but you should make sure that you're doing both, because remember, philosophy is done in language. You only understand a philosophical argument if you can explain it to somebody else. So I want you to show me that you can explain these arguments to me. Formatting for the paper does not matter, although I have had students in the past turn in stuff that's triple spaced. And while I get that that leaves space for comments and stuff, I'm going to have you turn this in online, so there's no reason to triple space anything. It just means that there is extra pages that I have to go through. So try to keep spacing no more than double space if possible. I want it to be clear and readable, so use normal fonts. Serif or sans serif fonts are fine, so that means serif fonts are things like New Times Roman or Garamond, and non-serif fonts are things like Calibri and Arial. I don't care. Use whatever works for you. Just make sure I can read it, and it's not difficult for me to figure out what the letters are. The other more important thing is I must be able to track down all of your citations. So be as consistent as possible. So this means that you need to have your Stephanus numbers with every paraphrase. If you use a different translation, I want you to have a works cited with that translation. If for any reason you look at a secondary source, I want to be able to track that down too. So give me the information that I need to do so. I'm going to have you do, before the peer review, we'll do a bad paragraph exercise on content and style, just so you can see what a bad paragraph versus a good paragraph looks like. And then some other tips for the paper. Don't give a claim and the justification in the single sentence. I've said this a couple of times before, but I just wanted to remind you because this is important. So split it into 2 sentences. And then what I highly suggest that you do to make sure that your paper is coherent is get somebody who hasn't taken the class to read your paper. So this is particularly useful if you have a sympathetic roommate who is not taking this class. You can offer to read one of their papers, and then they can read your paper in turn. And that will give you the perspective of somebody who isn't steeped in the material and will therefore be more likely to find small problems and errors and missing information than you would, because you know what's going on and you've got it all in your head, but they don't. So I highly suggest doing that if you have the opportunity to do so. Feel free also, of course, to come and talk to me, and I'm happy to help you with your paper.